There are rooms where your name becomes a weapon. And I learned that particular lesson in a ballroom at the Palmer House, with 400 people watching my mother decide to use hers on me. She didn't raise her voice. That's the part nobody understands about people like her. They don't need to yell. She spoke at the volume you'd use to order a coffee, and the words landed anyway. The way a verdict lands, when the jury has already made up its mind before anyone walks through the door. Before we jump into today's story, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Take a second and drop it in the comments. Also, I noticed that most people who enjoy these stories haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the channel and want more stories like this, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. Alright, let's begin. The Midwest Medical Alliance Foundation Gala. 400 physicians, hospital administrators, board members, the kind of people who built their reputations over decades and protected them like family secrets. The ballroom smelled like expensive flowers and the kind of wine that cost more than some people's monthly rent. It was June. The windows overlooked Lake Michigan, and every seat was occupied by someone who had learned, by necessity, to remember names, favors, and slights. My mother was standing at the podium in a navy gown, with pearl detailing at the shoulders. She'd had her hair done that afternoon, blown out and set in a way that read as elegance to people who still believed elegance was something you performed. She had introduced Marcus Chen first. Dr. Marcus Chen, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Northwestern Memorial, 45 years old, the kind of handsome that looked good in hospital newsletters and donor materials. She'd spent 6 minutes praising him. I watched her eyes light up the way I hadn't seen since my brother had gotten his acceptance to MIT when he was 17. Then she found me. I was standing near the third table from the stage, holding a glass of sparkling water that had gone warm in my hand. I was wearing my name badge, the badge that read Dr. Rebecca Caldwell, Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery, Lurie Children's Hospital. She looked directly at it. Then she turned back to the room and said what she said. I didn't move. I'd trained myself out of flinching years ago, the same way you train a reflex out of a nerve by repetition, until the pathway has to reroute itself entirely. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm. Steady, even. My face stayed neutral. Marcus Chen heard it from where he was standing at the side of the stage. He went very still. He was looking at my name badge, like he was trying to read something written in a language he almost understood. His expression moved through recognition, then something that looked like calculation, then dread. Then his jaw loosened just slightly, and he said in a voice that carried past the first 3 tables without him intending it to, "I'm sorry, did you just say Rebecca Caldwell?" The room shifted. All of it at once. But before I tell you what Marcus said next, and why it dismantled everything my mother had spent 30 years building in this city, you need to understand what happened in a kitchen in Oak Park, Illinois, when I was 11 years old, and my mother decided to tell me exactly what kind of woman she expected me to become. She never called it cruelty. She called it preparation. She had been a surgical nurse for 13 years before she married my father. She'd given it up when my brother was born, because my father made enough money. And she had certain beliefs about how a woman's intelligence was best spent. Not managing a hospital, managing the home. This wasn't bitterness, she would have said. It was a philosophy. And like all philosophies that are actually grief wearing a different mask, she held it with absolute certainty. My brother was going to be something significant. She had decided this when he was 4, and never revisited the decision. He was bright enough and good-natured enough to go along with it. By the time I was old enough to understand how narratives worked, the one in our house was already set. He would be the success. I would be something that didn't complicate that story. The kitchen moment happened on a Thursday. I had been reading my father's medical textbook at the kitchen table while my mother was trying to organize a dinner party for 8 people. The counter space was not available for things I hadn't been given permission to use. She didn't yell at me the way she yelled at the television during election season, or at the dog who kept getting in the garden. With me, she got quiet. She picked up the book, set it on the floor by the trash can, looked at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "You're going to embarrass yourself," she said. "And when you do, it won't just be you who has to live with it." I picked up the book without saying anything. I had already learned that saying something gave her something to push against. Silence was different. Silence was something she didn't know how to fight. That night, my father sat on the edge of my bed. He was a quiet man, a general practitioner in Naperville, with a small practice and a wife who had much louder opinions about how the world should work. He'd learned to speak in the margins of conversations, in the silences between things. He set his hand on top of mine for a long moment without speaking. "Your mother measures people by what they reflect back to her," he said finally. "You're not going to change that. But you can decide what you reflect." He handed me a piece of paper. He'd written something on it in his small, careful handwriting. A quote from Dr. Jonas Salk, the physician who developed the polio vaccine. The words were, "I felt that science should be something that benefited all mankind, not just a few." It was not hard to make. I folded that paper and put it in the pocket of my school uniform. I transferred it from pocket to pocket, notebook to notebook, textbook to textbook for the next 26 years until the paper was soft as cloth and the ink had faded to a whisper. It was the only thing in that house worth keeping. My mother's campaign against my ambitions wasn't loud. Loud campaigns draw attention, and attention could be redirected. What she ran instead was a sustained pressure system, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just makes everything slightly harder than it should be. When I brought home a 97 on a chemistry exam, she asked why it wasn't a 100. When I got the 100, she asked my brother the same question about his algebra grade, and the conversation moved to him, and mine disappeared. When I told her at 16 that I wanted to apply to Northwestern for pre-med, she set down her fork and looked at my father across the table. "Isn't it interesting?" she said to him as though I wasn't sitting 3 feet away. How some girls confuse attention with actual aptitude. My father looked at his plate. He had learned across many years of that marriage that intervening only made her double down later when he wasn't there to hear it. I applied to Northwestern without telling her, without asking for a fee waiver, without telling her until the morning I had already confirmed my enrollment. I set the confirmation letter on the kitchen table and I said, "I got in, I'm going." She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "You'll be back inside a semester, and when you come back, don't expect anyone to pretend this didn't happen." I left for Northwestern 11 days later. She did not hug me goodbye. She did not come to my car. She stood at the kitchen sink with her back to me while my father carried my last bag to the driveway. When I came back inside for the phone charger I'd forgotten on the counter, she had already moved it to the junk drawer without comment. The way you clear a table after a meal has ended. My father walked me to the car. He pressed his palm flat against my window after I shut the door. "Nobody's going to stop you," he said. "Not on my watch." I believed him. I had to. Medical school at the University of Chicago Pritzker was difficult in the way that's expected of medical school, but my difficulty was different. It wasn't the material. It was calling home on Sunday nights and having my mother pick up occasionally, speak in a clipped voice about weather or news, then hand the phone back to my father. I understood the message. I was on probation. The sentence would be revisited once I either failed so spectacularly that she couldn't ignore it, or succeeded in a way she couldn't explain away. During third-year rotations, I found the thing I was looking for. I rotated through cardiology, oncology, general surgery, and then I walked into pediatric neuro. The attending was Dr. Melissa Kowalski, trained at Johns Hopkins, with the manner of someone who had spent her career proving something without ever needing to announce it. She watched me in rounds for 3 days without speaking to me directly. On the 4th day, she called me into her office. "You have pattern recognition I don't usually see in 3rd years," she said. "What are you planning to do with it?" That was the first time in my life that someone with authority had asked me where I was going. Instead of questioning whether I deserved to go anywhere, I told her I wanted to do what she did. She nodded and went back to the chart in front of her. "Then stop being so careful about taking up space," she said. "You're not bothering anyone. Start acting like it." I carried that into every room I walked into after that. I matched into pediatric neurosurgery when fewer than 7% of practicing pediatric neurosurgeons in the country were women. I completed my residency here at Lurie. I did a fellowship at Boston Children's. I came back as an attending 3 years later, and 2 years after that, I was appointed chief. I called home the day I was appointed. My father answered. I told him. He went quiet in that particular way that meant he was crying and was not going to say so. "Rebecca," he said eventually. I know. I think your grandmother would have been proud. I know, Dad. We stayed on the line for another few minutes without talking. It was the most complete conversation we had ever had. My mother did not come to the phone that day. The letters I sent home found their way to silence. When I published my first peer-reviewed paper on minimally invasive approaches to pediatric brain tumor resection, I mailed her a copy with a short handwritten note. No explanation, no plea. Just, I thought you might want to know. It came back 3 weeks later, unopened. Her name was on the return label in her own handwriting. In medicine, when a diagnostic signal keeps returning negative, you don't keep running the same test. You revise your approach and move forward. I revised mine. I stopped waiting for her to change the channel she was broadcasting on. I went dark and got to work. My father got sick in June. He was 68 years old. Lung cancer caught at stage 3, which is its own particular kind of brutal mathematics. He had hidden the symptoms from me for 3 months. The way he hid most things that he believed would redirect my attention from where it was needed. When he finally told me, his voice on the phone was so steady that I ran through 3 mental assessments before I let myself feel anything. I flew to Chicago the next morning. He was smaller than the last time I had seen him. Disease compresses people, takes the volume out of the spaces between their bones. He was sitting in his recliner in the den, and he looked at me with the expression he always wore when I had done something that pleased him enormously. But he was not going to say so directly. You didn't have to come, he said. Yes, I did. I sat on the arm of the chair beside him, and we watched the evening news in silence for 20 minutes. My mother moved around in the kitchen. She did not come into the den. He died in September. 6 months. He made it to a Cubs game in August, which he had specified he wanted to do. I sat beside him in the stands and bought him a hot dog he was barely able to eat, and watched him watch the field with an expression of perfect, uncomplicated contentment. At the funeral home, I stood beside the casket in my dark coat. I had not worn my hospital ID or any professional marker. I was there as his daughter. That was the only role that mattered. My mother positioned herself at the receiving line with my brother and his wife flanking her. When people approached me to offer condolences, she intercepted their trajectory with a light touch on the elbow, a redirecting word, a smile that closed the lane. She managed the room the way she managed every room with total invisible efficiency. 2 hours. Not one person made it to me without being rerouted first. My brother saw it. I could tell by the way he kept almost looking at me and then looking away. He had spent his whole life being comfortable in that house, and discomfort made him slow. He wasn't a bad man. He was just someone who had never found a reason to pick a side. I stood beside my father's casket for 2 hours without moving. It was the only thing I could still give him. Presence, steadiness, the refusal to be diminished in the room where he lay. When it was over and the room cleared, I looked at her once across the flower arrangements. She turned away first. I came to the Midwest Medical Alliance gala because my department head asked me to represent Lurie Children's. It was a donor cultivation event, and my presence was requested, not optional. I had not known my mother would be there. I had not known she sat on the advisory council of the foundation, because she had not mentioned it in any of the 3 conversations we'd managed in the past 2 years. I walked into the ballroom and found my table and was speaking with a trauma surgeon from Rush when I saw her at the podium being introduced. I should have left then. I considered it for exactly 4 seconds. Then I calculated the professional cost of walking out of a room where 2 hospital board members were seated, and I stayed. I watched her praise Marcus Chen for 6 minutes. I had met Marcus twice at conferences. He was skilled and credentialed, and exactly the type of physician my mother would cast for this role. Tall, well-published, the kind of doctor she could explain to her friends without context. Then she found me and said what she said. Marcus's expression had not recovered. He was still holding the pause, still staring at my name badge when he stepped back from the podium, and said at a volume that no longer required a microphone, "You're Dr. Rebecca Caldwell from Lurie." It wasn't a question. It was a recalibration. My mother laughed, a light, dismissive sound she reserved for things she needed to neutralize quickly. "Elliot, sweetheart, don't let the title fool you. Rebecca has always." "Ma'am." His voice was even, but something underneath it had changed. He wasn't performing politeness anymore. He was doing something else. "With respect, I'd like to finish." The room went quiet. not gradually, all at once. The kind of silence that falls in an operating suite when the attending raises a hand. He turned to face the room. 20 months ago, I had a patient, he said, 9 years old, inoperable brain stem tumor. 3 different institutions declined to operate. Her family was told to plan for the end. I was one of the surgeons who looked at her scans and said I couldn't help her. He paused. Dr. Caldwell took the case. She developed an approach that none of us had mapped before. Used intraoperative MRI sequencing in a way that is now being cited in neurosurgical literature. And that 9-year-old who was sent home to die started 4th grade this past September. Someone at a nearby table made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She didn't call me when she took the case, Marcus said. Didn't ask for a second opinion from the surgeons who had already said no. She looked at the scans and she saw something we all missed and she operated. He stopped. He had the unhurried quality of a man who understood that silence was doing the work. Now, I don't know what Dr. Caldwell's mother told you tonight. I only know what she did in that operating room. And whatever you were just told about her, you should understand that there are children in this city who are alive because of the woman standing in this room. The table nearest the stage turned at the same time to look at me. The hospital board chairman set down his fork. My mother's champagne glass was on the podium. I watched her hand move toward it and then stop. She tried to recover. She was good at recovering. She smiled and touched the microphone and said in the light, airy voice she used when she needed to dismiss something by treating it as small. Well, Marcus has always been generous. The truth is, neurosurgery is Rebecca's whole world because she never had much of a life outside of it. Some people fill the hours. She waited. She always waited a beat for the laugh to come. No laugh came. The board chairman was still looking at me. A woman in the second row, white-haired with the kind of composure that comes from surviving a certain number of decades, stood up. She was wearing a name badge I recognized. Dr. Catherine Morrison, Emeritus Chief of Medicine at Northwestern. She had trained in the 1970s when the resistance to women was less polished than my mother's, but more openly stated. She raised her water glass in my direction. Not a toast, just a raise. A flag. A man stood beside her. Then another woman at an adjacent table. Then the ripple moved the way it moves in rooms full of people who have been waiting for someone to go first. No one spoke. No one applauded. They just stood. I don't know how many people stood. I stopped counting at 14 because my vision had narrowed the way it does in surgery, when everything peripheral drops away, and there is only the task directly in front of you. I walked to the stage. I didn't ask permission. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps and stood in front of the microphone and looked at my mother, who was 2 feet to my left, holding the stem of her champagne glass with both hands. The color in her face doing something I had never seen it do in 37 years. I spoke at a volume that carried to the back wall. I have spent my career in rooms where the margin between life and death is measured in millimeters. I have learned in those rooms that the people who make the difference are not the ones with the loudest opinions about who belongs there. They are the ones who stay when it is hard and do the work when no one is watching. That is what I have done. That is what I will continue to do. And no one in this room, regardless of how long they have known me, has the standing to tell you otherwise. I looked at her for 3 seconds. Then I stepped back from the microphone, descended the stairs, and returned to my table. I did not look at her again that night. Afterward, in the lobby while the valet line assembled, Marcus found me. He extended his hand and held the handshake a beat longer than professional standard. I should have said something sooner, he said quietly enough that only I could hear. I apologize for that. I told him I appreciated what he'd said. I meant it. I also knew that by the time he saw her, she had already finished and he had made the correction the only way available to him. I was not in the business of holding men accountable for the seconds it takes to process the unthinkable. She called me that night. I was on Lakeshore Drive, windows down, Chicago air coming in warm and thick and smelling like rain coming in off the water. I let it ring. She called again. I let it ring again. On the 3rd call, I answered because 3 calls meant she had moved past whatever script she'd prepared and into something unplanned. And after 37 years, I was professionally curious about what that looked like. Her voice, when it came through the speaker, was stripped of every layer of production. No refinement, no precision, just something thin and unsteady coming from a woman sitting somewhere in a quiet house with nothing but a glass of water and no audience. "I made a fool of myself tonight," she said. "That was all. It was not an apology." An apology requires the acknowledgement that something was done to someone else. This was an accounting of personal damage. The loss of standing in a room she had spent years curating. I merged onto the expressway and watched the Chicago skyline move past my window, lit up and enormous and indifferent to everything that had happened that evening. "Yes," I said. "You did." Silence. "I never understood why you had to make it so difficult," she said finally. "Why you couldn't just—" "I'm not going to have this conversation in a car on a Friday night," I said. "If you want to talk, call me when you're ready to talk about something real." "I'll answer." I ended the call, not in anger. The way you close a patient's chart at the end of a shift, calmly. With the knowledge that everything that needed to be documented has been documented, and tomorrow is a different shift. 3 weeks later, I drove to the cemetery in Oak Park where my father was buried. Early morning before the day had assembled itself, just the light coming low through the oak trees that lined the path. His headstone was simple granite. He had specified it. He had also specified the epitaph, which he had written on a notepad, and given to me 4 months before he died. In the October handwriting of a man making decisions about things that would outlast him, 8 words: a good doctor, a better father. He showed up. I crouched and set my palm flat on the stone. The granite was cold, cooled overnight by November air, and I let the cold settle into my hand and held it there without hurrying. I had brought the piece of paper with me, the one with Jonas Salk's words, transferred from pocket to pocket across 26 years until it was soft as cloth and nearly transparent at the folds. I had considered this decision for weeks. I told him what happened at the Palmer house, about Marcus and Dr. Catherine Morrison standing up and the people after her. I told him that I had walked up to a microphone in front of 400 people and said what needed to be said. "She called me that night," I said. "She said she made a fool of herself. She didn't say anything about me, but that's all right." I stopped waiting for that particular sentence a long time ago. The oak trees moved overhead. A car passed on the road somewhere beyond the tree line. "I think I was waiting for you to fix it," I said, "for a long time. I know that's not fair. You did what you could from where you were standing. You taped me back together in every way you were able. That was enough. That was more than enough." I unfolded the paper. It had been through medical school, residency, fellowship, 3 countries, the ICU at 2 in the morning, and 11 years of an attending's coat pocket. The words were still legible if you held it at the right angle. I set it against the base of the headstone, pressed flat by the weight of a small stone I picked from the path. "I don't need to carry this anymore," I said. "I've got my own words on the page now. You gave me the first sentence. The rest I wrote." I stood, straightened my coat, and held a moment of stillness that wasn't prayer and wasn't performance. Just a daughter standing at her father's grave in the early morning, with nothing left to ask for and nothing left to prove. Then I walked back to my car, drove to Lurie Children's Hospital, changed into my scrubs, and went to check on the girl who had started 4th grade in September. She was doing fine. Her last MRI was clear. She had gotten braces over the summer and was very interested in telling me about the colors she'd chosen for the bands. I listened to the whole story. I had nowhere else to be. Sometimes the proof you spent your whole life building isn't the credential on the wall or the moment in the ballroom when the room stands up. Sometimes it's a 9-year-old with a smile and plans talking about ordinary things. And you realize that the approval you fought for in one house was never the thing that was going to tell you whether you mattered. The work always knew. The work knew before anyone else did. And for someone who spent 30 years waiting to be seen, that was the only answer that was ever going to be enough.